Hello, everyone. This is Anneliese Abbott, and today I'm going to talk about soil and health, the philosophies that shape organic farming. Today, I will talk about what is organic farming, something we need to define. Where did the idea of organic farming come from? Is organic farming the same thing as traditional agriculture, which is a loaded question? And is organic farming scientific? Another loaded question. So, first of all, what is organic farming? Now, you're probably familiar with the USDA definition of organic farming. This is official. This is embedded in our laws. It says the application of a set of cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that support the cycling of on-farm resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. Now, I want to point out this is a very 1990s definition. Terms like biodiversity, cycling of resources, this reflects the time period in which this definition was written, which it was developed between about 1990 and 2002. So some people are saying this is a little outdated. It's not addressing some of our current debates. And so you have, for example, the Real Organic movement, which defines organic as growing crops in healthy soils and raising livestock on diverse pastures. One thing I want to point out that Real Organic has in their definition that the USDA does not is the whole idea of health. The USDA doesn't talk a lot about health. There's a little in the livestock section, but they don't actually talk about soil health, and especially not this overall context of health. Now, then we can go back. Organic farming, of course, existed for a long time before the USDA definition was made, starting in 1990. It actually goes back to the 1940s. And so you have in 1942, one of the first American definitions of organic farming by J.I. Rodale was that organic farming was a way to build soil fertility in a natural way and get crops that are fit for human as well as animal consumption. And then one of the founders of organic farming, Sir Albert Howard, he called it the birthright of humanity, fresh food for from fertile soil. So why did organic farming come about in the first place? In order to understand that, we need to go back to the 1930s, where there was this really bad global soil erosion crisis caused by bad farming. So I'm going to show a couple things here. This lovely landscape, it looks lovely from a tourist perspective. Like this might be somewhere out in, I don't know, Arizona, Utah. This is actually in Georgia. It's called Providence Canyon. And at the turn of the 20th century, this was just, or the late 19th century, this was pretty much flat, just small hills, and this was farmland. This was actually farmed. And then as the soil organic matter depleted, and they started to have soil erosion, which started out with small little rills and eventually turned into these giant gullies that destroyed like 3,000 acres of land. This is like a state park now. You can go hiking. You can even backcountry camp there if you want, which is cool recreation wise. But as far as agriculture is concerned, this was totally destroyed for agricultural purposes. And then you had, this is a similar one in Wisconsin, Coon Creek, Wisconsin. This is a farm. You see the barn back there. Here's a horse. There's a rider on the horse. You can't even see the rider standing on the edge of this gully. This is how bad soil erosion was. This is water erosion in both of these pictures. There was, of course, also wind erosion, the Dust Bowl, which I'm sure most people have probably at least heard of the Dust Bowl. This was terrible. Like there was so much agricultural land being completely destroyed by bad farming practices. And it wasn't just in the United States. This was a global problem in India, in Africa, in almost every place that had been colonized by Europeans. The profit motive to do plantation agriculture and produce monocultures for export had totally devastated local agriculture. And you were seeing this kind of serious soil erosion all over the world. It was really, really bad. And on top of this, you were starting to have problems with what they call degenerative diseases. So at the turn of the 20th century, doctors, the medical profession were really excited because they had just discovered communicable diseases, diseases caused by bacteria or viruses. And they discovered that sanitation and sterilization could kill germs. And so they thought that was the cure to every kind of illness, that if you sanitized everything, you sterilized everything, then you wouldn't have any more sickness. And they were able to really, eliminate diseases like cholera or typhoid or even smallpox through inoculations, things like that. But the problem was people weren't healthy. They started struggling with what they called these degenerative diseases. There was all these gastrointestinal problems. There was people had rickets. People had really bad eyesight, eye problems, and cancer, of course, diabetes, things like that. Instead of getting better with sanitation, some of these things actually got worse. They were trying to figure out what in the world was causing this. And some people said, maybe it has something to do with diet, with food. And so one of these people, Sir Robert McCarrison, he was doing research in India and he did studies with rats. So he observed as he's looking around India, there was a whole bunch of different people groups and they all ate different diets. And the people groups had various levels of health. Some of them were a lot healthier than others. So he tried feeding the diets of these different people groups and the Western European diet to different groups of rats. And here are some of the pictures. This rat here was eating what he called the Sikh diet, which was the best one. It had lots of whole grains, vegetables, dairy products, all sorts of healthy, natural foods. This poor emaciated rat's the exact same age. It was eating the modern European diet of processed, refined, white flour, white sugar, canned meat, canned vegetables. And that's what it did to this rat. So the rats eating the white man's diet, as they called it, were really sick. And this was a problem because this was one of the triumphs of science, was that we figured out how to take out that unnecessary, bran and germ and all that out of flour. And now it lasts a really long time because white flour doesn't go rancid because there's nothing in it to spoil. There's no germ anymore. And so this was considered modern and great. But it turns out when they fed that diet to rats, they were really, really sick. And the same was true of people. People that ate that diet weren't healthy either. And then, of course, you had people like G.T. Wrench. He wrote a book called The Wheel of Health, where he lauded the diet of the Hunza people in Nepal. They, like the Sikhs, like the diet that this rat was eating, it was mostly the whole grains, vegetables, fruits, dairy products, not a lot of meat, no alcohol, a very healthy, natural diet. And then, of course, most famously, you had an American dentist named Weston Price from Cleveland. So Weston Price was in Cleveland and he noticed that a lot of the people, especially the children that were coming to his dental office, had really horrible teeth. And he was trying to figure out what is causing this epidemic of dental decay. At first he thought it was a pathogen, but he couldn't isolate a pathogen. He's like, what is causing this? And so he actually traveled all over the world and tried to find people who were not eating that modern diet, that processed Western white man's diet. And so he visited indigenous people everywhere from like the Inuit of Alaska to the Polynesians in the South Pacific. He went to Peru, he went to Africa, he went to the Lone Shall Valley of Switzerland, he went to the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. All these people of all different nationalities, all different ethnicities and cultures, they were eating very, very different diets, but they all had one thing in common. They were natural whole foods. They weren't processed foods. And in every single place he went, the people who were eating their traditional diet had healthy teeth, and the people who were eating that white man's diet had nasty, rotten teeth and a bunch of other health problems. So here we go. On this side, these are the Inuit of Alaska, and these are people who are eating their traditional diet. And you can see their teeth are very healthy. These people are healthy. These people, on the other hand, very closely related. Some of them were brothers and sisters or children of the people on the other side. They were eating the white man's food. They were eating that processed white flour, white sugar, and they had horrible teeth. And it was all the cause of diet. So, and here's another one here. This is Switzerland. These are brothers. This guy here is eating the traditional food, and his brother here just had a sweet tooth and was eating all those cakes and pastries and all that. And you can tell the difference. This guy has a lot healthier teeth than this guy. They're brothers. Obviously, this is not a genetic thing. This was overturning the eugenic idea of the day, which was that genetics was what determined whether people were degenerate or whatever, and Price is saying, no, it's not genetics, it's a diet. These people are genetically the same, and yet some of them are way healthier than others. It's not genetics, it's the diet. So there was a lot of evidence that processed food was a cause of poor health. But some people started to ask, but did the problem go deeper? Did it matter how the food was grown? Because at the same time that there was this revolution in processing flour and sugar so that people were eating processed foods instead of more natural ones, at the same time, they also started using more chemical fertilizers in agriculture. So they were like, what recently changed in European agriculture? And so they started to look at this guy here, Justus von Liebig. He developed the mineral theory of plant nutrition back in the 1840s. And Liebig said, hey, look, the theory at the time was that plants built their biomass out of the humus in the soil. That's the carbon containing organic matter. Well, Liebig's like, well, that's silly. There's nowhere near enough organic matter in the soil to build the biomass of plants. Obviously, they are getting carbon from the atmosphere by photosynthesis, which was true. That is true. But then he went a little further and said, so the only reason that plants need humus in the soil, because he couldn't deny that soils high in organic matter grew plants well, but he's like, well, the only thing they're getting from that are the mineral elements. You burn a plant, the ash, what's left? You have mineral elements. You have like calcium, potassium, phosphorus, things like that. Those are what plants are getting from the soil. They get everything else from the air. And so the only thing plants really need from the soil are these chemicals. And so, following Liebig's advice, some of these scientists started one of the longest running research experiments in the world at the Rothamsted Experiment Station in England. And they had two identical plots filled with wheat. On one, they put farmyard manure, as was typically done in England at the time. And on the other one, they put chemical fertilizers, equal amounts of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus that were in the farmyard manure. And guess what? They had the same yields. So the plants that were fertilized with the chemical fertilizers grew just as well as the ones fertilized with manure. And so these people at Rothamsted started saying, hey, why mess with icky, stinky manure? It's so bulky, it smells bad, it's gross to spread it. Just sprinkle on some nice clean chemicals here, just pure nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and you can do just as well. Might as well get rid of the manure. But then they started having some problems where they had a lot more insect pests and diseases than they used to have. But not to worry, science had an answer for that too. All you have to do is spray pesticides. And at the turn of the 20th century, the biggest pesticides contained arsenic. The arsenical pesticides, things like Paris green and London purple. And then by the 1920s and 30s, they were using lead arsenate. And even to this day, there are old orchards where the soil is extremely contaminated with lead and arsenic from the lead arsenate that they started spraying at this time, because they were like, well, science can solve this problem. We can kill the bugs. We spray them with enough lead and arsenic. It hurt people too, but they didn't want to talk about that. So meanwhile, while all this is going on over in England and farmers are starting to use a lot more chemical fertilizers, that wasn't working in India. So India has a troubled history ever since the British started colonizing them. They started with trading in the 18th century, and then by the mid-19th century, they just went ahead and took over the government and made India a colony of England. And they extorted a large amount of taxes from them. The revenues were really, really high. Many of these peasant farmers were having to pay up to half or 2/3 of their total produce in taxes. The problem with this was that they were barely making enough, they were barely able to keep enough to live on themselves. In good years, this was fine, but the area is prone to droughts, and therefore, every time there was a drought and a crop failure, there would be these terrible famines, and millions of people would die because they didn't have anything stored up, because they hadn't been able to, because they were so poor, because the revenues were so exorbitant. And so there was some really serious problems. These famines in India were getting really, really bad. And by the late 19th century, I think the famines from like 1880 to 1900, they killed like 13 million people in India. It was really bad. And so after a while, the British government was like, well, maybe we should do something about this. They weren't going to acknowledge that the problem was the taxes. They weren't going to lower the taxes or say, oh, maybe we are extorting too much from these people. Maybe they need a little bit more. Nah, they had a better idea. They're like, well, we're going to ignore the social aspect, but we think we can solve the famine problem if there's more food. So we just need to improve Indian agriculture. Now, an interesting thing about this is that at first the British were really critical of Indian agriculture agriculture. But by the late 19th century, they were like, you know what? Traditional Indian agriculture is actually pretty good. There are some Indian farmers who are farming really well. There's some others who aren't farming as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the best farmers. We're going to see what they're doing, and then we're going to teach everybody else how to farm that way. And that's going to help improve agriculture, produce more food, and hopefully get rid of this recurrent problem of famines. And so one scientist who was tasked with working on this project was Sir Albert Howard. He was first at the Pewson Research Station, and then he started the Indoor Institute of Plant Industry in 1924. And his problem that he had to solve was that in India at the time, there were a lot of cattle, but not all of the manure was available for fertilizer because it was traditional to use a lot of the manure as cooking fuel for cooking food. And other British were like, oh, you've got to stop, burning animal manure. You've got to just use firewood. But a lot of these areas, firewood was scarce, and the manure was a better material for slow cooking the vegetarian diet. And so Howard's like, okay, whatever. We're not going to try to change that. We're going to say, it's okay. You can use some of your manure for cooking. What we're going to do is we're going to see if we can compost what's left of the manure with all of these plant residues, which we got a lot of, compost those together and make a compost that's as good of fertilizing value as pure manure, but it uses a lot less manure. As they were working on this composting, one of the experiments that they did at the Pewson Research Station was they tried to duplicate those Rothamsted experiments. So they had, just like they did at Rothamsted, they had their control patch. They had one that they fertilized with just pure manure, and then one that they fertilized with the NPK, the chemical fertilizers. But unlike at Rothamsted, they had some really different results. At Rothamsted, the chemicals and manure, remember, had about equal results. But in India, the chemicals, they did okay. They increased yields by about 40% over the control, but the manure increased yields by 100% over the control. So clearly, organic matter was something that was lacking in the Indian soils. And the difference here was the climate. England's a very cold climate, and India is a pretty hot tropical climate. In tropical climates, the soil microorganisms are very active, and they very quickly oxidize any organic matter in the soil. So there's not as much organic matter in tropical soils because they're so warm, there's so much microbial life, it just burns it up really, really fast. Whereas in colder climates like England, the soil organisms aren't active in the winter, and so organic matter can pile up. But in India and tropical soils like that, it's really, really important to keep adding that organic matter to the soil. And another thing that Sir Albert Howard discovered as he did these composting experiments was that properly made compost had just as good of yields as the manure. So he had these exact same kind of results where the compost doubled the yields over the control on all sorts of different crops. So composting really worked. It was really a viable solution to the fertilizer problem in India. So that was one thing that was going on. That was in India. And meanwhile, you have back in England, remember I talked about that degeneration, that concern about health. So Howard was looking at the soil health in these experiments. But back in England, you have this dude, Lionel Picton. He was a doctor, and he was interested in human health and this connection between nutrition and health. So he was part of this group called the Cheshire Medical Committee, which met in 1939 and wrote this really important document called the Cheshire Medical Testament. So they linked these degenerative diseases, which were digestive ailments, rickets, dental decay, and anemia, to bad diet. And so Picton was the one who picked the keynotes for their conference they had in 1939. And he wanted two people to speak. He picked McCarrison, who did those rat studies I talked about earlier, and Howard, who had recently moved back to England to talk about his composting research. And so out of that research, Howard suddenly realized that there was a connection between the soil and health. So he's like, okay, so composting organic matter is the key to making a healthy soil. And he had already observed that the plants growing on that soil were way healthier than plants that weren't fertilized properly or were just given chemical fertilizer. So organic matter and compost really made plants healthier. And then the animals that ate those plants were healthier, and the humans that ate the plants were also healthier. This was the jump that he made after going to this conference. So Howard published this book in 1940 called An Agricultural Testament, in which he said, yes, healthy soil full of humus grows healthy plants, In fact, they are so healthy that pesticides are unnecessary because the healthy plants can resist pests and diseases. Also, animals and humans who eat a balanced diet of healthy animals and plants are also going to be healthy and not have those degenerative diseases. And that was that fusion between the composting research and this concern about diet, nutrition, and its connection to health. And it came together in Howard's Agricultural Testament. Now, I want to point out Howard and the Cheshire people and all that, they were not the only ones in the world who were looking at this. There was also a movement that started in Switzerland. It started in 1924 when this guy here, Rudolf Steiner, he was the founder of a religious group called Anthroposophy, and he gave a lecture on agriculture in 1924 because his followers came up to him and said, look, we see all these problems. You know, food is just not as nutritious as it used to be. We see all these problems with agriculture. Can you give us like spiritual cause of why this is happening? And that was what his lecture was about. So, unfortunately, Steiner himself died about a year after he gave the lecture. So he was not really involved in this next part of the history. But his followers were like, ooh, what he said in this lecture is got some things that we really can develop into a good farming system. There wasn't really much practical farming advice. It was more philosophical, spiritual advice, but they used that along with their knowledge of good farming practices to develop a system that they called biodynamic farming. And the first biodynamic farm in the United States was Threefold Farm in New York, Spring Valley, New York, very close to New York City, only like an hour or less commute by rail or bus or however they did it in that day. And so Threefold Farm was the first biodynamic farm in the United States, started in 1926. But so there were people farming there. Biodynamic farming is a farming system that focuses on health from a spiritual perspective. So all of what they said about health, soil is important, nutrition is important, they agreed with all of that, but also said there's a spiritual dimension. And so the original lectures by Rudolf Steiner were kept secret up until the 1950s. Nobody who wasn't an anthroposophist was allowed to read those. But one of Steiner's close followers, Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, he took these ideas of biodynamic farming and wrote a more perhaps secularized version, but I'm not really going to, that's what people have called it, but I'm going to say more of just, he took out that esoteric terminology. The ideas were all still there, but he framed them in scientific language instead of Steiner had some kind of odd terminology he used. And Pfeiffer didn't use that terminology. He used terms that farmers and scientists would understand. That made sense. And so he published this really important book called Biodynamic Farming and Gardening in 1938. And the main point of this book was a holistic view of the farm as an organic whole. He used that word, organic whole. He did not call his system organic farming because he called it biodynamic farming, but a bunch of people who listened to him started calling it organic farming, organic agriculture, organic gardening. Those were people who had listened to Pfeiffer. All of the candidates for being the first ones to use that all listened to Pfeiffer's lectures. So I really think Pfeiffer is the origin of that term organic as far as an organic farming system. Biodynamic farming, it had this emphasis on composting, on ecological balance, and on mixed farming. And Pfeiffer came to the United States himself in 1940. So he had operated a really big and successful biodynamic farm in Laverdale, Holland. And this fed, I think, 600 people. It had a bakery. It was a very large farm, grew really good vegetables. People were happy to pay extra because the quality was so good. It was great until the Nazis invaded Holland. The dikes got bombed. The farm got flooded with seawater. Pfeiffer had to leave. He came to the United States. And so he was offered a position by this guy named Alaric Myrin, who started a farm school in Kimberton, Pennsylvania, in this house here, which still stands today. It's now a Waldorf school, but this was the original location of the first biodynamic training school in the United States, the Kimberton Farm School. And so Pfeiffer moved there for a few years, and then he had his own farm in Cheshire, New York. He eventually ended up at Threefold Farm in Spring Valley that I talked about earlier. So Pfeiffer spent the last 20 years of his life in the United States, and he was a very key figure in bringing biodynamic and organic farming to the United States. So at this Kimberton Farm School in 1942, he offered a really intensive 6-week biodynamic course. And this told you everything about farming. It wasn't just composting, it was how to raise livestock, how to judge cattle. It had all the economics. It had beekeeping. It had gardening. It had how to lay out your garden. It had spiritual lectures. It had astronomy lectures. It was a very intensive and holistic course, and it covered like practically every aspect of farming. And so there were a few other people too. So there was kind of this movement for agrarianism and back to the land that got connected with biodynamic farming. You had people like the leader of the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, Luigi Ligutti. He really liked biodynamic farming because he liked the idea of society as an organic whole. And so this idea of the organic whole, this holistic idea, this fit very well with the Catholic agrarian philosophies of that time period. And he had down here Ralph Borsodi. He founded the School of Living in Suffern, New York, which is only 7 miles from Threefold Farm. So he found out about biodynamic farming really early in 1937. He was one of the first non-anthroposophic people to find out about it, and he got really excited, and they started farming biodynamically at the School of Living. They went to Europe and saw the farms just before the war started, so they must have gone in 38. And so they saw biodynamic farming, brought back the ideas. They were farming biodynamically at the School of Living in 1939. And then you had this couple here, Paul and Betty Keene. So they have an interesting story. They were actually Methodist missionaries in India, and they were friends with Mahatma Gandhi. And so when World War II started and the British were trying to conscript Indians into the war effort, they were like, no, this is not what this is just oppressive colonial violence. We don't want any part in this. We're for nonviolence. We're for Indian nationalism. And the missions agency said, no, you're disrespecting the government. You have to leave. And so they left India, came back to the United States. They went to the School of Living first. They actually helped co-run it for a period of 2 years with another couple named Ralph and Leela Templin. And then in 1942, they went to Kimberton Farm School, studied under Pfeiffer for a couple years, rented a farm for a year, and then in 1946 finally purchased their own land near Penns Creek, Pennsylvania, and they started a farm called Walnut Acres, which went on to become the original mail order organic food company in the United States. So something I want to point out, and this is a chapter of the history that has really not been written about yet, and that is that most of the earliest organic farmers in the United States, all of these people I've talked about so far, they used biodynamic farming before they started using the word organic. They called it biodynamic. And so they used the two words interchangeably until this other guy came along, and he's one you may have heard of more, J.I. Rodale. So J.I. Rodale grew up in New York City, and then he started his own business with his brother, an electronics manufacturing firm, and they moved to Emmaus, Pennsylvania at some point, and he was on a line. He liked to do publishing, so he wasn't like a big publisher at all. His magazines didn't have a very good circulation. It was a net loss. You just funded it with some of the profits from their manufacturing business. But Rodale was really interested in health. And he would read all these quirky little health magazines from all over the world. So in 1940, he was reading one of these little magazines called Health for All, which was a British health magazine, and he found a review of Howard's book, An Agricultural Testament. So in Rodale's description, he was like, whoa, I got so excited and immediately had to go back to the land and try this farming technique. Now, in reality, he probably also went to the School of Living, talked to Ralph Borsodi. He did go to Kimberton and talk to Ehrenfried Pfeiffer. There's evidence of this. Rodale didn't always mention that in his narrative, but he definitely did connect with these people. And then in 1942, a whole 2 years after he first found out about it, he started publishing a magazine called Organic Gardening. Actually, the first issue was called Organic Farming and Gardening. As you can see from this picture here, this is the table of contents of the first issue. And an important thing to note is that he had an article by Sir Albert Howard and also one by Ehrenfried Pfeiffer. And then he had an excerpt from Charles Darwin's book about earthworms, which is probably not Darwin's most famous book, but a very interesting one about earthworms and vegetable mold and all of Darwin's very meticulous observations about earthworms. So those were the first 3 articles in the first issue of Organic Gardening magazine. And I should have changed this slide because I had put here that Rodale was the first American to use the term organic farming, but I've just found evidence that the School of Living was using terms like organic agriculture and organic gardening in their literature going back as early as 1937, 1938. So I really think that Rodale probably got this idea either directly from Pfeiffer or from the School of Living. Now, credit is usually given to the British farmer, Lord Northburn. He used the term organic farming in his 1940 book, Look to the Land. Now, Northbourne, the year before he wrote that book, had a big biodynamic farming conference at his farm, where Pfeiffer talked about the farm as an organic whole. And so I think it's quite likely that Northbourne also got that term from Pfeiffer. But definitely the term organic was being thrown about in the United States before Northbourne published his book. So I think it definitely came from Pfeiffer and biodynamics. But anyhow, it wasn't very standardized until Rodale. And Rodale was the first one to really standardize this term, organic farming. And that became the term that was used after for the system that hadn't really had a set name before that. So, to sum all this up, these were all the early leaders, founders, if you put it that way, of organic farming. And the way they defined it is organic farming had an emphasis on rebuilding and maintaining soil health using organic waste, green manures, and compost. It emphasized preventative methods of pest control because healthy plants resist diseases and pests. It had a lot of emphasis on crop rotations, mixed farming, and this concept of the farm as an organic whole. That was really important. And then, not last but certainly not least, from the beginning, the whole point was to grow high quality produce and get it to the consumer as fresh as possible. People like Rodale didn't get interested in it so much for the farming aspect as because they wanted this healthy food and they knew it was better food than what you could get at the store. And so if the only way to get that was to grow it yourself, then grow it yourself. But from the beginning, Rodale especially wanted to get this commercialized so that everyone would have access to this healthy organic food because it was so much better when it was grown in healthy soil. So now I'm going to talk about another question. So one of the questions I am asked very frequently when I tell people, oh, I'm researching the history of organic farming, and they're like, well, yeah, didn't everybody used to farm organically? And that is actually kind of a loaded question. And here's why. The answer can sometimes be yes, sometimes it's no, and sometimes it's like, well, partially, but not. The problem is that there are different definitions of this term, traditional agriculture. There's a good one and there's a bad one. So I'm going to start with the good one, the positive definition, the one I think most people that ask me are probably thinking of this one. So they might equate it with indigenous agriculture, but I'm going to say it's especially an emphasis on historic farming methods because indigenous agriculture just refers to who is doing it. It's often a mixture of older and newer and different traditions. And so traditional agriculture is something that has been going on in the same place for the same time. So I like to define this as foodways developed over centuries by people with a deep connection to their land. There's a very strong sense of place in traditional agriculture. It's uniquely adapted to a specific location and climate. And then by definition, it also predated chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and Western science. I also don't like to lump it all into one category because there are as many types of traditional agriculture as there are climatic and regions in the world and different ethnic groups. So traditional agriculture, what exactly that is, varies a lot depending on where you're talking about. It's very, again, place-based agriculture. Now, I do want to make everyone aware there is also a very negative definition out there of traditional agriculture. Started in the 1950s, is still used by some development advocates today. And so this idea was that traditional agriculture was based on pre-Newtonian science and technology, i.e. non-Western. It was inevitably poor. backwards, inefficient, stagnant, people living just on the verge of starvation, where one crop failure would make them all starve, just like they were having those problems in India. Now, the problems in India, of course, were not because traditional agriculture was that way, but because the British had made agriculture that way. But this distinction is lost in this kind of definition. So yeah, backward, inefficient, stagnant. By the 90s, this kind of campaign saying traditional agriculture was bad had kind of merged to low yielding and environmentally destructive, hence this cartoon I have here, which the only thing I can say about this cartoon is at least these guys look fairly white, so you can't really call it racist, but it is very derogatory. They've kind of lumped all of what they call traditional agriculture into this concept of shifting agriculture or slash and burn agriculture, which is not the way most people in the world traditionally farmed, not at all like this. But this was the stereotype. So this really negative stereotype was out there because they were trying to discredit organic farming, and so this is what they called traditional agriculture. So just be aware when someone says traditional agriculture, figure out which definition they're using because they're both out there. So okay, so is organic farming traditional agriculture? So, and I'm going to go back here to the better definition, those foodways developed to a specific place that actually worked, not the stereotype of slash and burn. But anyhow, was organic farming traditional agriculture? So I'm going to say organic farming was inspired by traditional Asian and European farming methods. Sir Albert Howard was very influenced by a book that F.H. King wrote called Farmers of 40 Centuries. King was a soil science professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He traveled to China, Korea, and Japan, observed traditional farming methods there, traditional composting, and he wrote a book about it. So Howard was inspired by that. But organic farming did not use those exact methods. Like, yes, it borrowed concepts, but they didn't farm exactly like Chinese farmers farmed. Organic farmers didn't farm exactly like Japanese farmers farmed. Even what they did in India was not exactly the way Indian peasants had farmed traditionally, even when that worked. So again, most of these elements from organic farming, things like composting, green manuring, crop rotation, were used historically around the world, and they worked. So these elements were included. It definitely used concepts from traditional agriculture. They were synthesized with modern science. So you used modern science to explain why these things worked. And also it was made to be kind of like a globally applicable system. So it kind of lost that sense of place. What Howard was promoting as organic farming, you could cut and paste it to any country in the world. Of course, you adapted to the climate and whatever, but the concepts were more universal. And that was a uniquely Western construct. So it wasn't traditional agriculture in most of the places where it was done. It was still good agriculture, but it lacked that sense of place, that tie to a specific place, a specific piece of land, even though it was in general good for the land. It was developed as a modern alternative to chemical intensive farming, which was also trying to be this universalistic system. So I would say organic farming was inspired by traditional agriculture, but in its universal applicability differed because traditional agricultural systems work where they were developed. They need to be modified to go to other places. So then there's the other question out here. Is organic farming scientific? And boy, oh boy, is this one a loaded question because it really depends on how you define science. So here we have a article from Fertilizer Review in 1951 where they're comparing science versus witchcraft. And the article starts out, reputable scientists in agricultural colleges and universities, men who for years have studied the effects of chemical fertilizers on soils, plants, and animals, including man, deplore the exhibitionism of the organic farming theorists. So yeah, these agronomists starting in the 1950s said that organic farming was totally unscientific. And I have another video that I made called Can Organic Feed the World, in which I explain why they were saying this and the historical context for these ideas. But then there's this other interesting thing is that most of the founders of organic farming were scientists. So this makes it really complicated as to whether or not it was scientific. Organic farming was developed by scientists. That's a fact. Sir Albert Howard, he was a plant scientist. He worked his entire career as a government-paid plant scientist in colonial India. And he actually, not only was he a scientist, but he was actually following the scientific consensus of his day when he developed his composting method in the 1920s and 30s. He cited the works of other scientists in the United States, like Selman Waxman. He was a professor of microbiology at Rutgers University. He came up with a very famous concept in composting, the carbon-nitrogen ratio, which is used by organic farmers all over the place. And F.H. King, I already talked about him. And then composting scientists at Rothamsted, England, because even though Rothamsted was where they came up with the idea, they said that you didn't need organic matter, that chemical fertilizers were enough. But by the 1920s, they realized that even though the yields were similar, the wheat plants that were fertilized with manure were healthier and the yields varied less. And so they were actually doing research on composting by the 1920s, and Howard cited that. And then you got Ehrenfried Pfeiffer. He was a scientist, he had a PhD, and he developed his biodynamic methods using lots of scientific experiments. He had a greenhouse, he had a laboratory, he did plot experiments. I mean, they were all scientists. They were using the scientific method. And this fit into the scientific consensus of the 1930s and early 1940s, which emphasized soil organic matter. So soil conservation emphasized controlling erosion with plants. Remember I showed you that nasty picture of the gully earlier in Coon Creek, Wisconsin. Well, this is that same region. I don't think it's exactly the same place as that gully, but this is one of the techniques they use to stop soil erosion. It's called strip cropping. And so these are the different colors of strips are different crops that are all planted on a contour. So row crops are interspersed with either grasses or small grains, and this keeps soil from eroding. So this was what the Soil Conservation Service was recommending. Malabar Farm here in Ohio, Louis Bromfield was really focusing on grass farming, keeping those steep slopes in grass. The USDA even focused their entire 1948 agricultural yearbook on grass farming. In the up through 1950, about, even fertilizer companies were saying that their products worked best when combined with manure. They were saying, yeah, organic matter is important. We still want you to buy our fertilizer, but you got to have organic matter for it to work. And I've written a lot more about this in my book, Malabar Farm. So if you want to learn more about this scientific working with nature movement that did exist in the United States at that time, there's a lot more about that. But organic farmers did always differ a little bit from mainstream science in that they were really critical of reductionism. So Howard wrote a lot about the evils of fragmentation. He criticized the laboratory hermit who learns more and more about less and less. He's like, specialization has gone too far. Reductionism does not reflect the real world. Pfeiffer, in the same way, took this very holistic perspective, the organic whole. He emphasized that the farm was a living organism. Every part is important. You can't look at plants separate from soil, separate from animals, separate from people. They're all part of the same organic whole. Organic farmers always believed that reductionist experiments could never explain all the intricacies of life. And so they were especially critical of lab studies and greenhouse experiments. Growing plants in pots in a climate-controlled environment does not reflect real-world conditions. So they always emphasized whole farm studies, like Lady Eve Balfour with the Hawley experiment in England. The idea was that you needed to compare the whole farm system. You couldn't just take a small plot and say, oh, we put organic fertilizer on this one and chemical fertilizer on this one. That didn't capture the essence of organic farming. It had to be the whole system, included plants and animals and the farmer and the land all together as an ecosystem. And so that was where organic farming differed from the more typical agronomy that was being practiced at the same time. Now, when it came to technology, because see, everyone thinks the debate is about science, but a lot of these debates are actually about technology. Fertilizers and pesticides, especially pesticides, they're actually a technology. They're not a science per se, they're a technology. And so when it came to technology, organic farmers were not Amish. I mean, there are Amish organic farmers, but organic farmers as a group in the whole were not opposed. They had no fundamental opposition to modern technology. They used tractors. They used machinery. In fact, they even invented some pieces of machinery. This thing here was invented by a guy in England named Friend Sykes. He wanted to be able to turn his compost piles, and so he invented this machine to do it. And then this is a compost grinder. Those were always advertised in Organic Gardening magazine in the 50s. So little machines, they developed, like I said, new machinery to make compost. not. What they were opposed to was the chemical technologies like pesticides and fertilizers because of their really negative influence on the environment. So they evaluated each individual technology to see whether it worked with or against nature. They didn't just say all technology is great and wonderful. They were like, let's do it on a case-by-case basis. Is this working with nature or not? If you can make better compost, yeah, that's great. But if you are killing soil life and overriding natural processes, nah, we don't want to use that. So now we're back to how in the world do we define organic farming? So, organic matter is the key to building a healthy living soil. Healthy plants grown on healthy soil resist pests and diseases. And then animals and people eating a balanced diet of whole foods are healthy. This is this holistic perspective. The farm is an organic whole. We would use the term ecosystem more today. It means pretty much the same thing. Each part affects all the others. And most importantly, we can never fully understand how nature works, but we can work with it instead of against it. But then here's the question that I have asked myself a lot. So organic farming works. Organic farming is really a good system. It is one of the environmentally best farming systems out there. So why doesn't everybody do it? And there's a reason for that. There was a concerted scientific attack against organic farming starting in the 1950s. This cartoon here was published in Country Gentleman magazine, The Organic Farming Myth. This was the Dean of Agriculture at Kansas State College, Ray Throckmorton. He said, when cultists relying on half-truths, pseudoscience, and emotion attack the farmer's use of commercial fertilizer, it's time to expose the fraud of their doctrines before serious harm is done. So there's some big concepts here about progress, development, and science, which I talk about in my other video, Can Organic Feed the World? So check that out if you want to know why everyone doesn't farm organically. It's not because organic farming doesn't work. It's because there was this real concerted attack against it. So if you have any questions about this, please email me at my website, historyoforganic.com. I have my email list here. Just realized the picture of myself has covered up the Facebook QR code, but just go to my website here. You can also link to my Facebook from that. So I'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, any suggestions, want to have me give a live speech, the more people I have signed up for my email list at some point, I'm hoping to put these ideas into a book. And so the more people I have that are interested with my stuff, interacting with it, the easier it will be to get a publisher. So thank you so much for watching this, and I hope to hear from you soon.